Hello and welcome to the WIHS Journal, Public Affairs from 104.9 FM. I'm Paul Kretschmer. Today we're going to be speaking with professional counselor Meredith McDaniel, who works out of Charlotte, North Carolina area, about her book, In Want of Plenty, Waking Up to God's Provision in a Land of Longing.
Sure. Well, I was writing an article actually for the first magazine in print that I ever submitted to, and at the very tail end, the very last paragraph, for some reason, I just talked about manna in regards to God's provision, and that is, the substance that falls from the sky with the Israelites in the desert, where you can find that in Exodus. And so from that moment on, that was about 7 or 8 years ago, I have just latched onto this concept and this metaphor of manna and just how similar our lives in modern day are actually to that of the Israelites back in the ancient days. And so just seeing that those patterns of our longing and our aching here on earth as we await heaven, and starting to uncover that we actually have God's provision in the form of manna in different ways in each of our lives in different seasons has been something that I've been writing more about, and now it's in the form of a book.
I know that you have worked as a counselor. Do you think that a layman without your experience would have come to the same conclusions, or perhaps maybe in a different way?
Oh, it's a good question. Well, I do sit with a lot of people every day, and so I do have a front row seat of hearing about people's stories and their pain and the things that are going on in their life. And so I do think I have an advantage in some ways of being able to see those patterns that are persisting, maybe in a different way than the average person. But I do think that this concept of being able to start to look for the manna and the provision in our life is something that anybody can do, and that's kind of what I touch on in the book.
Circling back around to the first question I asked you, many people who do some of the sort of thing perhaps that you've done here in your writing often draw from the New Testament as a natural thing. What makes it unusual for you to draw from the Old Testament? I know there are some churches where the entire Bible gets taught in one form or another throughout the year, or lessons are read over the course of the entire year. And then there are some other congregations who tend to focus mostly on the New Testament and only touch on the Old when there's a point to be made because it's linked directly to something that happened during or after Jesus' active ministry on earth. What caused you to think of manna, for instance? I guess I'm kind of trying to get inside your head a little bit there.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a really good point. Most Christians these days, we want to focus on the New Testament and when Jesus walked the earth, because that is a tangible way for us to relate to God's grace and His forgiveness and His mercy. But I will say, if we look back at the Old Testament, something that I have come to appreciate over the years is the richness and the fullness that the whole story, the whole narrative of the entire Bible, both the Old and New Testament paired together, really bring us into the full gospel story. So it's hard to have grace and mercy without figuring out that we have a need, that we need to be rescued. And I think that when we look at Exodus, it is it's a parallel to the whole gospel narrative, because it is a group of people who are walking around in a desert, and before that even, they were under the rule and reign of Pharaoh, an oppressor, and maybe an enemy, if you will, which we still have an enemy today. And they needed a rescue, and they needed deliverance. And that is exactly what Moses does for them in the Old Testament, which is some foreshadowing for what Jesus does for us in the New Testament.
I've interviewed someone recently who said that rather than simply refer continually to our past history, we need to refer to it because it gives us a context for our now, but we also need to look at how we will write forward our story rather than simply getting caught along in the current without feeling or exerting any sense of control about how our forward will look and feel to us. What's your impression of that sort of situation?
Yeah, well, I was actually talking to somebody else on an interview this morning just about how, as a people, we like to look ahead. We like to either talk about how we're feeling right now, or we like to say, this is where I want to be. This is my goal. This is what I want to do. And, in January, this is a great time to think about that. But as a counselor and as somebody who looks at, people's stories through the lens of the bigger picture, something that I have found, and I cover this in the book, is that it is helpful, if not necessary, for us to look back at our story the way that we were raised, the different things that have happened in our life up to this point that are actually informing everything that we think about the world, the way that we interact with people, the way that we think about God, the ways that we, the jobs that we take, the ways that we parent. It really does deeply impact everything. And I hear you. We don't want to get lost there. We don't want to get stuck there. But we do need to take a look back in order to move ahead, in my opinion.
I have utilized beneficial counseling in my past as well. And one of the lessons I learned early on was when you're tempted, or when I'm tempted to say, oh, that's just the way I am.
Right.
I'm already off to a bad foot because essentially I'm resigning from the future and simply choosing to sit and stew instead of either going forward or more likely slipping further backward.
Right, and we can get stuck there. That's where we get paralyzed in our story. And my hope is that through this book and through when I'm sitting with counseling clients and even just talking to friends, that we would be able to acknowledge why we have these beliefs that we have about ourselves and about others, so that we can have some movement and not just say, this is how I am, but that we can lean into that hope and the transformation that Jesus offers in a relationship with Him through His strength and not through our own, that we can change and we can heal and we can be a different person than we just think we are.
There's a lot of motivational speakers nowadays. I'm not going to name any names, but there are motivational speakers. You see them in infomercials, you see them on talk shows and things like that. And they often or mostly seem to come from the perspective of the person who has completely got their act together, nothing is wrong in their life. And the first thought that occurs to me when I see people talk like that is, well, then how can you possibly relate to where I'm at if nothing ever goes wrong in your life? But I've seen within the pages I've read that you're not like that. You have chosen to share with readers, and in some ways what some might call a vulnerable sort of way, in order to relate to people and to successfully make points that you want to convey, because you actually feel or have known how people have felt and known themselves before.
Yes, and I think it's so important for us to remember that this is a lifelong journey. There's not a quick fix. There's not a 3-step process, and I know that that's countercultural to what most people would say. But I just think there's a lot more mystery in this world than we are willing to say, and that we are not in control, and we don't necessarily have the power within ourselves to, write the story that we want to write. Now, when we lean into the co-author of our story, and we're willing to enter into counseling or spiritual direction or meeting with a pastor, even a close group of friends in our community that can be a healing space, we can change and shift. And I think it's really important. And so I don't want to hide my mess and my struggle from other people, because I just don't think it's helpful.
I was listening to a broadcast that runs during my air shift at the radio station each night by Dr. David Jeremiah. And the point that Dr. Jeremiah was making was, when people suggested to me that I journal, I thought, oh, gee, that's something women do. Men don't do things like that. But eventually, through a variety of means, the Holy Spirit enabled him to see the value of journaling in his own life, and he can't really envision his life now without being able to take stock, as it were, by that way. Journaling, what based on what he suggested to me, what can you suggest for people that would cause them to understand what the value of that process or that discipline can represent in their own life, in terms of seeing who they are and where they're at and where they can move forward?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things with that. I am someone who really loves to journal and processes life through writing, and I always have been. But for some people, that doesn't mean writing pages and pages and pages. So we need to look at it in a way that you could write a word a day. You could write a sentence a day. They even have journals called One a Day or a line a day, that really you can go back and look at that, and you can have documentation and be able to trace God's hand in your own story. And for some people, if you don't like to write, it could be typing. It could be doing voice text. That's something I'll be riding down the road and I think of something, and I just voice text it onto my phone. And so It can be through a variety of mediums. It doesn't have to be longhand. You can get some really great practice, honestly, in my book, because I put a ton of guided journaling questions in there, not just at the end of the chapter, but throughout. I'll say a couple concepts or thoughts, and then I've got a couple questions for you, and you can sit and ponder on those. And I even have a narrative journal that pairs with the book to kind of go deeper in some of that. But I think it's just trying it out. And like you said, not judging it as, a stereotype that it's just a woman thing, but that it can be for everybody if we can just have open hands to try it out and see how it goes. And there's not a right way to do it. You just do what works for you.
I really appreciated your putting those suggestions or advice at the end of the chapter, because I've read some books sometimes where they all come up at the end of the book, and sometimes I'm tempted to just read the book, but not really go beyond the page, which could conceivably in the motion picture business say on it the end.
Right.
I like it better that you placed them where you did, so that I could integrate them more thoroughly with what I had just read in a chapter, for instance.
I'm so glad that's helpful.
Yeah, there are different ways of constructing books, and I appreciate the way that you've done yours, among other reasons for that reason right there.
Well, it was a team effort, so I'm grateful for my publisher and editors, too.
Yeah, I know editors are very, very important. People like me who write by ourselves and work on the air as I do don't have that advantage. We tend to have to be our own editors because there is no one else to do it, and sometimes we're not as critical on ourselves as we ought to be.
Yeah, that's true. It's good to have extra eyes to speak into our life, writing or just life itself.
that is for sure. What 3 things can we do today to become more tuned into God? You've had a lot of time to think about that, and I'd like to hear your suggestions right now, because I'd like to be able to put myself, as well as listeners tuned in right now, in the position of being able to say, hey, yeah, that sounds like it's reasonable. Let me see if I can do something like that right now.
Sure. Well, I think the first thing is we just need to slow down. We live at a really fast pace in our world today, and we need to quiet the space and be able to, even if it's just turning off the radio every now and then when you're in the car and just having 5 minutes and then turning it back on, because I love music and I love radio, but sometimes I just need a little quiet.
Yep.
I think another thing is moving, so physically getting active, sweating and moving, and eating well and drinking well. It's amazing the impact that has on our whole being and our mental health and our spiritual health. And then I think the third thing is leaning into our people. So I talk a lot in the book about communities, and, the Israelites were coming out into the desert tribe by tribe, and we need our people today. If we just want to hide behind this kind of illusion that everything's okay, kind of like you were saying earlier, nobody really knows us. And so we have to be willing to be vulnerable and lean into our communities so that other people can lean into us and so that we can heal together. And it's messy and it's not always easy, but I think it's worth it. And I think that's where full life is found.
I know that people have schedules to maintain and competing interests in their life. You're a writer, and you have a family, and counseling responsibilities, and so on. How does someone like you maintain the kind of healthy balance that doesn't end up skewing in one direction or another to the detriment of any of those interests, or maybe to all of them simultaneously if you just break down in the middle?
Sure. Well, it's a learning process. That is something that I'm really trying to figure out today, right now, as I'm doing interviews and I'm away from my family this week before my book launches. Excuse me. And so I think that it is saying yes to the things that God's calling you to do, and everything else just has to be a no, because our people right in front of us matter the most.
Thank you very much, Meredith McDaniel, for making your time available to me today. Very much appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Once again, I've been speaking with counselor Meredith McDaniel, based in the Charlotte, North Carolina area, about her book, In Want Plus Plenty, Waking Up to God's Provision in a Land of Longing. For further information, call us at 860-346-1049. The opinions expressed are those of the participants, not necessarily those of the staff or management of the station. I'm Paul Kretschmer on the WIHS Journal, Public Affairs from WIHS, Middletown.